Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric. Let's talk about some unconventional commander decks. And today I want to talk about the dungeon mechanic from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. I've got a couple of deck decks I want to share with this mechanic, and today I want to talk about Acererak the Archlich. This is a 5/5 zombie wizard that costs 2 and a black, and it has whenever Acererak the Archlich enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tome of Annihilation, return Acererak the Archlich to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. And whenever Acererak the Archlich attacks, for each opponent you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, unless that player sacrifices a creature. So we can see that Acererak can do two things. From that second line of text, Acererak can make a bunch of zombie tokens, up to 3 each combat when it attacks in a 4-player game, unless your opponent sacrifices creatures. But in order to do that, we first need to get Acererak to stick on the battlefield, and to do that, we need to complete Tome of Annihilation. Now let's talk about dungeons a little bit. I'm not going to go over the rules of dungeons too much here, but briefly there are 3 dungeons that exist right now. Whenever you venture into the dungeon, you'll pick whichever of those 3 dungeons that you want, if you're not already in a dungeon, and you enter the first room, then trigger the ability listed on that room. If you're already in a dungeon, you'll instead advance to the next room and trigger the ability in that room. Once you complete a dungeon and venture again, you can pick a new dungeon, and you can venture into the same dungeon as many times as you want. Okay, with that out of the way, Acererak requires that you complete Tome of Annihilation before it'll stay on the battlefield. But, of course, like with many builds for Acererak, we're interested in venturing into any dungeon other than Tome of Annihilation, because if we never complete Tome of Annihilation, then Acererak just lets us continually venture into a dungeon just by casting it, then it returns to our hand so we can do it again. So there's 2 other dungeons to pick from, the Lost Mine of Phandelver and the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. I'm not going to read through all of the rooms in these dungeons, but just as a brief summary, the Lost Mine of Phandelver is generally used to drain your opponents to death if you manage to venture into the dungeon indefinitely, or at least if you venture a large numbers of times, with the room that causes each opponent to lose 1 life and you gain 1 life. It can also be used if you're just trying to complete dungeons quickly, but you don't want to go through the Tome of Annihilation. That doesn't really matter in this deck. The Dungeon of the Mad Mage doesn't inherently provide a win condition, but it does provide a bunch of card advantage and some mana advantage. Now, when I build a Dungeons deck, and again I'll have another one to share with you later too, I try to have a specific game plan in mind, and typically a specific dungeon in mind. And with this deck, we'll be focusing on using Acererak to venture into the Dungeon of the Mad Mage to generate value when we cast Acererak over and over. And if we do manage to generate an infinite, or at least very large number of Venture triggers, then we can go into the Lost Mine of Phandelver to drain our opponents. But this isn't necessary. We don't need infinite dungeon ventures to win, and we don't need the Lost Mine of Phandelver, but it is an option. And that's our game plan. This is a very single-minded deck. We'll cast Acererak to venture into the dungeon, and again, generally any dungeon other than Tome of Annihilation. But we will generally focus on Dungeon of the Mad Mage to generate value, or the Lost Mine of Phandelver if we can venture many times as a win condition. And again, then after casting, Acererak returns to our hand, we cast it again, and repeat. We'll use cost reducers and plenty of ramp to help us cast Acererak as many times as possible, and we'll find other tools that we can use to gain value or to harm our opponents as we cast Acererak over and over. So again, this is a very single-minded deck. Your goal is to cast Acererak as many times as possible, and that's it. Now let's talk about how we're going to do that, starting with our ramp and our cost reducers. We have a bunch of ramp cards in this deck because we want to cast Acererak as quickly as possible and as many times as possible. I'm not going to mention every single piece of ramp, but we have a massive 17 ramp cards in this deck because we're that serious about casting Acererak a lot. We're focusing as much as possible on low mana cost rocks that can generate black mana, because with our cost reducers, which we'll talk about later, we can often reduce Acererak's casting cost to a single black mana, but we don't have as many options for reducing the black mana in Acererak's cost, so we'll want our ramp pieces to be able to generate that black mana. Star Compass, Charcoal Diamond, Corrupted Graphstone, Arcane Signet, Cold Steel Heart, Fellwar Stone, for example, all of these just cost 2 mana, and they typically produce black mana for us. We still value colorless mana ramp too. I'll use Thought Vessel here, since if we get our game plan going, we can be drawing a lot of cards, so that no maximum hand size limit can help us out a lot. Our other ramp is pretty self-explanatory. Again, I won't mention it here, but you can check out a link to the deck list in the description for more details. And besides all of that ramp, we do have 9 cards that reduce the cost to cast Acererak. Most of these just reduce the colorless mana that we'll spend, but we also do have ways to reduce the colored mana cost too, that 1 black in Acererak's cost. Herald's Horn, Cloud Key, and Jet Medallion are all artifacts that reduce Acererak's cost by 1 generic mana. Helm of Awakening does the same, but it also reduces the cost of all spells by 1 generic mana, including spells cast by your opponents, so be careful with this one. Bantu's Monument reduces Acererak's cost by 1, and it also causes each opponent to lose 1 life, and you gain 1 life whenever you cast a creature spell. So this is not only cost reduction, but also a possible win condition if you can cast Acererak an infinite number of times, or again, just a really large number of times. And Undead Warchief also reduces Acererak's cost by 1, but it's on a vulnerable creature body, so it's not quite as good here. Now, Undead Warchief also buffs your zombies by +2/+1, which sounds awesome, but we really don't care about that in this deck. And finally, there's Heartless Summoning, an enchantment which reduces Acererak's cost by 2 generic mana. It also gives all of your creatures -1/-1. This is generally a very good deal for us, but we do have a few ways to make creature tokens in this deck, and Heartless Summoning will be a non-bow with those cards, because a lot of those tokens are, 1 toughness, so Heartless Summoning will kill them, so do be careful with this one. There's Urza's Incubator. This is an artifact that reduces the cost of a creature type of your choice by 2 mana, which is great. But I really want to talk about Carnival of Souls. This is an enchantment that costs 1 and a black, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you lose 1 life and add black. So this won't reduce Acererak's cost technically, but it will refund you 1 black mana each time you cast it, which is basically the same thing most of the time. And again, because we're generating black mana with Carnival of Souls, if you have other cost reducers that can reduce the generic cost by 2 or more, Acererak's cost will be 0, allowing you to cast it as many times as you want. Well, within reason. Carnival of Souls will drain you for 1 life whenever a creature comes into play, including your opponent's creatures, and of course each time you cast Acererak. We do have some ways to mitigate that life loss. We just mentioned Bantu's Monument, for example, and we have a few more too. We'll talk about some of the other ones that we've got later. But anyways, with a combination of some of these cost reducers, we can potentially reduce Acererak's cost to 0 and go infinite, or at least really, really big. Okay, so now we can cast Acererak quickly and frequently, so we can do a lot of dungeon venturing. But we do have other ways to take advantage of casting Acererak over and over. Let's talk about those next. We have plenty of ways to take advantage of casting our commander repeatedly, in addition to just venturing through dungeons. A Tome of Legends is an artifact that gets a page counter whenever your commander enters the battlefield or attacks, and you can pay 1 and tap it and remove a page counter to draw a card. This will easily accumulate more page counters than you'll be able to spend, essentially drawing you an extra card per turn for just 1 mana each time. There's Vanquisher's Banner, which costs 5 mana to cast, but it provides even more value. You'll choose a creature type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, but more importantly, whenever you cast a creature of the chosen type, you draw a card. Just be careful not to deck yourself. No, really, be careful. This is not a May ability. You must draw a card. There are several ways that we can kill our opponent's creatures too, just by casting Acererak. Relic Amulet is a 2-mana artifact that gets a charge counter whenever you cast an instant, sorcery, or wizard spell. And yes, Acererak is a wizard. You can also pay 2 and tap it and remove all charge counters from Relic Amulet to deal that much damage to target creature. There's Deathmatch. This is a 5-mana enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, that creature's controller may have target creature of their choice get -3/-3 until end of turn. Now this is a symmetrical effect. Your opponents will get to give a creature -3/-3 whenever they have a creature enter the battlefield too. But we don't have many creatures in this deck, and Acererak usually isn't on the battlefield, so our opponents will usually just be aiming this effect at someone else, which is great for us too. But do be aware that we have a few high-value creatures in this deck, and our opponents will be able to kill them easily if we have Deathmatch in play. We'll use Orc Sure-Shot. This is a weaker, more vulnerable version of Deathmatch. It's a 4-mana creature that has, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. But at least this one affects only us and not our opponents. But I really like Noxious Ghoul. This is a 5-mana creature that has, whenever Noxious Ghoul or another zombie enters the battlefield, all non-zombie creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. Of course, Acererak is a zombie, so Noxious Ghoul is a potential repeated board wipe. Again, we just use this repeatedly until our opponents remove it. And of course, Noxious Ghoul itself is also a zombie, so it won't kill itself. Now again, it's 5 mana and it doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield, but if it survives for long, Noxious Ghoul will absolutely decimate your opponent's battlefields over and over without doing much to your side of the board. Now again, we don't have a lot of creatures in this deck, but we do have ways to generate lots of creature tokens whenever we cast Acererak. Genesis Chamber is a little artifact. It has whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. Be aware that this is another symmetrical effect, so your opponents will generate mirror tokens as well, but you will probably get much more value out of this than your opponents. There's Diregraph Colossus. This is a 3-mana 2/2 that generates a tapped 2/2 zombie whenever you cast a zombie spell. There's Oketra's Monument, a 3-mana artifact that reduces the cost of white creature spells you cast by 1 generic mana, which doesn't affect us. But more importantly, whenever you cast a creature spell, you make a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. There's Endrick Sar, which gives you X 1/1 black thrall creature tokens whenever you cast a creature spell, where X is that spell's mana value. But whenever you control 7 or more thralls, you have to sacrifice Endrick Sar. Now, Acererak's mana value is 3, even if you've reduced the cost to cast it. So casting Acererak twice will generate 6 thrall tokens, which is pretty sweet. Now if you cast Acererak again, you'll need to sacrifice Endrick Sar, unless you can sacrifice some of those thralls. We do have a couple of ways to do that, which we'll talk about later. And then finally there's Mishra's Self-Replicator. This is a 5-mana artifact creature that, whenever you cast a historic spell, that's an artifact, a legendary, or a saga, you can pay 1, and if you do, you get to create a token that's a copy of Mishra's Self-Replicator. So this can get out of control, but we do need to pay the extra 1 mana to create these tokens with Mishra's Self-Replicator. And again, with a lot of these creature token generators, just be careful when using Heartless Summoning, since this gives all those creatures -1/-1, which will just kill them, except for those tokens made by Diregraph Colossus, which are 2/2s. So again, just be careful with that. And then finally, we've got a couple of ways to use those token creatures to help us generate mana to keep casting Acererak, and none of these will surprise you. Ashnod's Altar lets you sacrifice a creature to generate 2 colorless mana. With a creature token generator, Ashnod's Altar lets you reduce Acererak's mana cost to essentially just a single black, just by sacrificing that creature token that you generate to the altar. Phyrexian Altar potentially lets you go infinite, because if you combine it with other cost reducers, it lets you sacrifice a creature token to generate a mana of any color, so it can pay for that black mana in Acererak's cost. And either of these altars lets you sacrifice the creature tokens produced by Endrick Sar, so you'll never go above the 7 or more thrall tokens that would cause you to sacrifice Endrick. And Endrick Sar is really great, particularly in combination with Phyrexian Altar, because you get 3 thrall tokens, and with Phyrexian Altar you can sacrifice all 3 of those for black mana, which lets you, by itself, cast Acererak indefinitely. So even though we only have a few creature token generators that let us take advantage of Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar, I've decided to include them in the deck anyways, since they're immensely helpful in helping you cast Acererak infinitely if you've got one of the token generators. So besides just venturing into dungeons, we do actually have ways to win the game by casting Acererak over and over. Let's talk about some of those next. So our objective with this deck is to venture into the dungeon as many times as possible, possibly infinite times. But we do have alternative methods for killing our opponents, even if we can't manage infinite venture triggers. Aetherflux Reservoir is one of the most well-known examples. Just as an example here, if we reduce Acererak's mana cost to a single black mana, which is fairly reasonable for this deck, and we have 8 black mana sources on the field, then we can cast Acererak 8 times in one turn. This will give us 36 life with Aetherflux Reservoir, and if we get above 50 life, we can threaten an instant kill on any single opponent. Tendrils of Agony is sort of a weaker, single-use Aetherflux Reservoir that our opponents won't see coming. This is a 4-mana sorcery that costs 2 black. It has target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. But it also has Storm. This can finish off opponents at low life totals, or of course if we can cast Acererak infinitely, and perhaps we just don't have enough cards in our library to finish off our opponents by venturing through the Lost Mine of Phandelver, Tendrils of Agony is another win condition. There's Ayara, First of Locthwain. This causes each opponent to lose 1 life and you gain 1 life whenever another black creature enters the battlefield under your control. So this triggers each time you cast Acererak, or more if you've got a token generator like Endrixar or Diregraph Colossus, which generate black creature tokens. For each cast of Acererak, for example, Endrixar generates 3 black Thrall creature tokens, which will drain your opponents for 4 life each time you cast Acererak. This is brutal. There's Blasting Station. This is a 3-mana artifact that can tap and you sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. But whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you untap Blasting Station. So with any creature token generator, you'll get to do 1 damage to a target each time you cast Acererak by sacrificing that token. And again, Endrixar supercharges this effect, letting you do 3 damage for each cast of your commander. And Blasting Station is cool because if you need to take out any creatures, you can do that too. You don't need to just hit players. And finally, I really like Cabal Paladin. This is a 4-mana 4/2 that has, whenever you cast a historic spell, Cabal Paladin deals 2 damage to each opponent. And again, historic spells include legendaries like our commander. Well, without any other help whatsoever, Cabal Paladin hits our opponents for 2 every single time we cast Acererak, which is awesome. So that's how we win the game. I want to mention a few miscellaneous cards that have useful synergies with our game plan, but don't really fit into any of the other categories we've discussed. Panharmonicon doubles up all of our Enter the Battlefield triggers, and this means each time we cast Acererak, we venture into the dungeon twice. This is really good and really obvious, so I don't need to say much more about it. I also like Prism Ring and Demon's Horn. These are artifacts that cost 1 or 2 mana respectively, and they gain you 1 life whenever you cast a black spell. Demon's Horn also works whenever your opponents cast black spells. Now, these are fairly unusual includes. These cards only gain life for us, but I still think they're valuable here. First, the life gain can offset the life loss from something like Carnival of Souls. Secondly, we don't have blockers in this deck, really. There are only 9 creatures in the deck, and only a few cards that reward us with creature tokens. So these just help us survive, and the mana investment is really small. Again, these artifacts only cost 1 or 2 mana to cast, and they don't cost anything else to provide that life gain value over time. Then I've also got Paradise Plume. This is a fairly expensive mana rock at 4 mana, and when it enters the battlefield you choose a color, and it taps for a mana of that color, and whenever a player casts a spell of that color, you gain 1 life. Now, 4 mana for this kind of underwhelming mana rock is a lot, but again, we have 0 defenses in this deck, so we can really use that life gain, and we will be casting Acererak a lot. Finally, we'll use Path of Ancestry. This land enters tapped and taps for a mana of any color, and when you use that mana to cast a creature that shares a creature type with your commander, you scry 1. Although it's worded weirdly, this effect does trigger when you cast your commander, so you can get a free scry 1 every turn just by having this land, which is not super impactful, but it's on a land slot, so it's fine. And that is the deck. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Acererak dungeon combo deck has an average mana value of 2.76. We are only running 8 creatures in the deck, not counting Acererak. Actually, most of our cards are artifacts, and there are 36 of those. There are 11 cards that effectively reduce the mana cost of our commander, though some of them are situational, like Carnival of Souls, which technically refunds mana rather than reducing the cost, or Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar, which technically also only refund mana, and only when we have a token generator that makes creature tokens when we cast Acererak, so that we can sacrifice those tokens for the mana. We have 5 token producers. Each of these produce 1 or more creature tokens specifically when we cast Acererak, and I'd probably include more, but there really aren't any more. Again, these creature tokens can be used offensively or defensively in combat, or we can sacrifice them to mana to one of the altars. There are 15 other cards that give us some sort of value whenever we cast Acererak. This is a rather diverse set of cards. I'm not counting those creature token generators, but I am counting removal like Deathmatch, Storm cards like Aetherflux Reservoir and Tendrils of Agony, Ayara First of Lochthwain that drains our opponents, a Vanquisher's Banner which draws us cards, Prism Ring which gains us life, for example. So there's a lot of diverse cards that give us value when we cast Acererak. We're running 17 pieces of mana ramp because, again, we really want to cast Acererak as quickly and as frequently as possible, and cost reducers are only part of that equation. We have 7 sources of card draw, but remember that venturing into the Dungeon of the Mad Mage also draws us a bunch of cards. For each time we complete the dungeon, for example, we will draw up to 5 cards and scry up to 6 times, or we'll scry 3, scry 2, and scry 1. So we have plenty of card advantage in this deck. We're using 10 single target removal spells and 6 board wipes, because again, we don't have a lot of creatures, so wiping the board is pretty important to us. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $455.52 on tcgplayer.com. I haven't really made any exclusions from the deck based on budget, but there are some cards that I've chosen to exclude for other reasons. First, there's Semblance Anvil. This is pretty popular in Acererak decks. It's an artifact that costs 3 and it has imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card from your hand, and spells you cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 less to cast. Now, Semblance Anvil would be great for reducing Acererak's casting cost, but we'd need to exile a creature card from our hand to imprint onto it. And again, we only have 8 creatures in this deck. We can't really afford to waste those creatures, they're all pretty valuable. So I've excluded Semblance Anvil from this deck. I've also chosen not to include tutors. This is more of a playstyle choice. I think tutors often make decks too consistent, especially the universal black tutors. This is great at higher power levels, but it might not be fun for casual play. So again, I typically don't run many tutors in my deck, and you won't find any in this deck list. But of course, add them if you like, and you'll definitely power the deck up. Tutors can help you find things like your creature token generators, Phyrexian Altar, Carnival of Souls, things like this which will help you venture into the dungeon indefinitely, but which require a fairly specific combination of cards out of the deck. And that is the deck, Acererak the Archlich. Again, this is a very single-minded deck. Everything in this deck is built around us casting Acererak, venturing into a dungeon other than Tome of Annihilation, and then Acererak returns to our hand, so we do it again. This deck will do absolutely nothing without the commander, so we are very reliant on Acererak. Fortunately, Acererak's Enter the Battlefield effect returns it to our hand, so it can be quite hard for our opponents to interact with. But if they do manage to do so, for example by countering Acererak or killing it with an instant speed removal in response to its Enter the Battlefield trigger, we will have to put Acererak back in the command zone, and it will cost us commander tax to cast it again, at least the first time. Once it returns to our hand after we cast it that first time, we can just pay its normal mana cost. But that's also why we have a bunch of ramp in this deck, so we can afford to pay that commander tax if we need to. Nonetheless, if our opponents have a bunch of removal or they're just really determined, it's theoretically possible for them to shut this deck down by killing or countering Acererak repeatedly, and again, if they do that, this deck will be completely worthless. Fortunately, it will be very costly for our opponents to do this, as they'll have to kill Acererak many times, at instant speed, before the commander tax will be too high for us to cast it. So despite being reliant on our commander, this deck is pretty resilient and hard to interrupt. That said, while this deck was really fun to build, it's not really the kind of deck I like to play typically. You can take some very long turns as you venture repeatedly into the dungeon, you get a bunch of dungeon triggers, and try to sequence your actions so that you generate as much value as possible. Your opponents may spend a decent amount of time just watching you play Magic, which may not be fun for them. And this deck can be very binary. Either you'll go off and generate tons of value, or you'll struggle to defend yourself against aggressive or removal-heavy opponents. There's very little middle ground for this deck. But again, this deck was a lot of fun to build, and if you like this type of combo deck, I hope you'll find value from the focus that I've put here into just making the game plan work. We aren't playing with any zombie tribal nonsense. Everything in this deck, again, is singularly focused on getting value from Acererak's Enter the Battlefield trigger. We have lots of ramp, lots of cost reduction, and payoffs for casting Acererak repeatedly. This deck is designed to do one thing, and to do it well, and if you like that kind of combo and value game plan, you might enjoy playing this one. But that is all I've got for today. Come back soon, as I'll have deck techs for at least a couple of more Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander. The next one I'll have is another dungeon deck, because I'm really trying to explore this mechanic. and our commander for that deck will be Hamapashar Ruinseeker. But we'll talk more about that later. That is, again, all I've got for today. Thank you for watching.